Okay, get ready for Chaucer. I'm going to try to cover some of the things that were in the video that I had found earlier and is now sadly taken down. So, who is Geoffrey Chaucer? Let's start there. He is often called the father of English literature. We can get to why that is later. He was born in London in the Middle Ages, sometime between 1340 and 1345. They don't have exact dates, although they do know a lot about Chaucer's life because eventually he ended up in a government job, like working as a bureaucrat. So he made a lot of documents, and there are a lot of records, even though they're 800 years old at this point. They still have records of Chaucer, so they know a lot about him and what he did. He lived during a really interesting time for the English language. We are leaving the period of Old English, which is what Beowulf was written in, and which is very Germanic in structure and vocabulary. That's the influence of, the Vikings. And we're leaving the Old English behind. We're entering into the days when Middle English is spoken. Sounds a lot more like the English that we have today, but still not totally there yet. And the major event in history that has caused Middle English to come about is the Battle of Hastings. How can a battle make a language? So, the Norman Conquest is what we call it. There was a dispute over who was the true king of England. Edward the Confessor was the king. He died, and he had apparently left it a little bit ambiguous. And King Harold, the Anglo-Saxon king, claimed the throne, and so did William, Duke of Normandy. And Normandy is on the other side of the English Channel in France. So William, Duke of Normandy, decides, nope, I'm going to be the king. He loads up his cavalry onto the boats and crosses the channel and lands on the beach. That was in October of 1066, and we have the Battle of Hastings, which is my favorite date in history, 1066. William the Conqueror overcame the Anglo-Saxons. King Harold of England is defeated. He literally gets an arrow through the eye. And the story of all this is told in the Bayeux Tapestry, which actually isn't a tapestry, it's an embroidery, but whatever. And it tells the whole story of the conflict and the gruesome battle and the defeat. So after the Battle of Hastings, the defeated Anglo-Saxon king and the thanes, which is what they called all of their noblemen and lords and people who are in charge, those guys are all tossed out. Their estates are seized and given to the French lords and nobility, all of William's friends. So as now what we have is a pretty divided society where the upper class and the people in charge are French. They have French language, French customs, and everybody else, all the leftover Anglo-Saxons, are still speaking Old English. So, as part of William's plans for solidifying his power, he orders a kind of census or an accounting to be made of all his lands and estates that he now rules in England. So he orders his people to make a comprehensive record and to value the lands, to see who owns them, etc. So this was ordered in 1086, and the result of that is a book called the Domesday Book. It is this archive with all this information. We know a ton of stuff about medieval life and what it was like to be in England in 1086 because of the Domesday Book. And it is currently housed at the National Archives in London. They have some pretty old copies. I would just love to go and see that someday. So, the Norman Conquest is setting up a really divided society, and these divisions are described as the three estates of medieval society. The three estates. The first estate is the Roman Catholic clergy. These are the priests and the monks and the bishops and such, and they take care of all of the sacraments. They have registries of who born, who's married, who's died. And they have a lot of power because they can collect a tithe to begin with. And also, of course, they have the power that, their theology is if you don't get the sacraments, then you're not going to heaven. So that's a pretty strong power to hold over people. And that's the first estate. The second estate is the royal family and the nobility. And they have the power of, the king's military. They have all the wealth. They own all the land. And, of course, they have the power to collect taxes. Then the third estate is everyone else. The languages of the first and second estates are Latin and French. And all official court business happens in French, while the peasants are still going around speaking Anglo-Saxon English. But more and more French vocab is creeping in. There's always intermingling of people and intermarrying of people, and pretty soon English is going to start transforming. It's going to get this big influx of French vocabulary, although it still has a Germanic sentence structure, and we've still got some leftover Anglo-Saxon words. So this division of society into these estates, historians look back on this divided arrangement and call it the feudal system or feudalism. So for the 10th to 13th century, that's European medieval societies. It's a social hierarchy. It's based on local administrative control and distribution of land into fiefs, F-I-E-F-S. So a landowner or a lord would give a fief along with the promise of military protection and other protections in return for a payment of some kind from the person who received it. And the person who receives it is called a vassal, V-A-S-S-A-L. So the payment of the vassal to the lord typically comes from like feudal service, so like military service. He promises to fight, for the army when the neighboring lord attacks, or regular payment of his produce. So maybe he raises pigs, in which case every so many months he has to deliver X number of pigs to his lord. So that is the feudal system. Now let's talk about the chivalric code. So knights within the feudal system have this special code of honor, the Knight's Code of Chivalry. That's an expected standard of behavior for knights in the Middle Ages. The knights are sworn to uphold their duty to God and to the church, and their duty to their lord, who's given them their fiefdom. And also they have a duty to protect those less fortunate, like women and orphans. So this is an honor code. And these are all imports from French ideals, from the French romances in literature. The chivalric code eventually actually morphs into the Renaissance and Enlightenment idea of a gentleman. And we still understand the idea of a gentleman as looking and behaving a certain way with a certain honor and degree of decorum. So that idea traces itself all the way back to chivalry. Another part of this system and these codes and rules for how society behaves is a thing called courtly love. Courtly love is complex and idealized. It is love and it also isn't love. It's more prevalent in literature and culture. I'm not sure how many real, actual people were involved in courtly love the way it's sort of understood and described, but it's throughout the literature for sure. And it's an ideal, perhaps, to be aspired to. It involves sometimes a secret and non-physical love between a knight or a courtier and a woman of higher social status. Sometimes the woman is married. But this love is not consummated. It is just this source of like longing and desire from afar. And it's also like a spiritual elevation. So the women are idealized. They are unattainable. They're Their beauty is indescribable. They're perfect and pure. So that is how the woman is in the idea of courtly love. The knight would direct his devotion toward her, and he views her as the embodiment of perfection. And his love for her motivates him to do good things and good works. So the only thing he's going to get in return is maybe a token of her admiration, or a look, a glance, an approving glance from her. The knight is the humble servant to his lady, and he is loyal and selfless. And this is unrequited love. So the focus is more on a mental connection or a spiritual connection, and there's not a lot of, it's not fulfilled. And again, these ideals originated in France, particularly associated with Eleanor of Aquitaine. Okay, another thing to talk about in the Middle Ages that is affecting the world that Chaucer is living in are the Crusades. Dates of the Crusades, I don't know exact dates. They're like 1,000 to 1,300-ish. There were several of them, and some were more holy than others. Let's put it that way. There's a lot of complex motivation for what's going on with the Crusades and the people that are in charge of sending all of these Christian soldiers off to fight in the Holy Land. So what happens in the Crusades is Christian knights travel to the Middle East. They're going to win back Jerusalem for Christendom. So Jerusalem has changed hands many times in the 1,000 years since Christ. But when Muslims take it over, which happens, I don't know, in the maybe 700s or 800s, maybe before that, it's just not safe for Christians to go there anymore. And Christians want to go on pilgrimages to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem and surrounding areas. So one of the goals of the Crusades is to make it safe for people to travel to the Holy Lands on their pilgrimages. Well, a side effect of this is that trade routes are going to be opened up from the east into medieval Europe, because silks and spices and porcelain and other beautiful goods come from the east. And with these trade routes opened up, now they can come into Europe. So this leads to the rise of the merchant class. So they're still members of the third estate, but now they have another option for their lives besides just serfdom and, digging in the mud or raising pigs and living in a thatched hut. They could go on the road and learn trades, and they can get quite wealthy. So merchants gaining this wealth through these trade routes, now they've got some power. They've got a foot in both worlds. So even though they're members of the third estate, their customers are the nobility. And so this is the rise of the middle class, or in French, the bourgeoisie. Chaucer is from a bourgeois family. They were wine merchants. So this allows him to travel, to be educated. He would have known Latin and French. This is what allows him to get that government job. And this is what allows him to become this master of the newly formed Middle English language. Middle-class merchants arrange themselves into guilds. Guilds are like associations of craftsmen and merchants. They're formed to promote the economic interests of their members, and they protect each other and mutually help each other. They advance and expand economies. They train apprentices and pass on specialized skills. They're kind of like a quality control. If you wanted to be a baker and have a trade working as a baker, you would have to join the guild. And that would not necessarily be easy. You'd probably have to pledge yourself to a master, be an apprentice for many years, which is kind of like being his slave. But in exchange, you learn the skill, and once you're in, you've got some power. They have influence over the local governments. They can do price controls. Controlling who's in and who's out is a pretty important power. So this is another way that the middle class expands their power, despite not being in the upper class. And this is how they start in society. You start talking of people being upwardly mobile. So you might start at the bottom of the social hierarchy, but you can move yourself up. You still have to be born into the nobility, but you can if you're not, you can raise yourself up at least in quality of life and in wealth and in some power because of trading and merchant class and guilds. Another aspect of medieval life that was new and exciting in Chaucer's lifetime was the university. The idea of a university is a medieval concept. I think it was the University of Paris, I believe, was the very first university ever founded. But shortly after Paris, in London, in the 13th century, Oxford and Cambridge were both founded. So you could get an education, which would not have been the case for anyone in the Third Estate before the founding of universities. The final part of medieval life that I want to talk about in this little lecture here is the Black Death. There were several outbreaks of the plague over the course of a couple hundred years in the Middle Ages, including one during Chaucer's lifetime, and it killed more than 30% of the population. Okay, so this is some of the background information that's going to help us as we start reading the Canterbury Tales. We're going to be noticing that his characters are members of certain estates of medieval life, and they are participating in these various things that I just talked about in medieval life, and they're going to be using that Middle English, and I think we're going to do another video that expands a little bit more on Middle English.